Hello, we're just going to give a few minutes here for people to join us. Nice to see some names here of people who've joined us before. Okay, we'll go ahead and start with introducing myself. I'm Michele Ruiz. For those of you who are new to this conversation, we do our virtual conversations on a monthly basis. I'm the CEO and co-founder here at BiasSync, and we are talking about how anti-Semitism plays out in workplaces and what workplace leaders should know. Joining me for this very, very important conversation is Alyza Lewin. She is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center and for Human Rights under Law. She leads efforts to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses through legal advocacy and education. She's also co-founder of Lewin and Lewin Law Firm, LLP. And she specializes in litigation and mediation, has done some high-profile cases, including Avi Zinger's successful lawsuit against Unilever. She's argued before the U.S. Supreme Court, which influenced U.S. passport regulations regarding Jerusalem. I've had the pleasure of spending several hours with her, learning more about her work and the Brandeis Center and its work. And I'm delighted to have her as part of this. So I just want to share that this is one of a two-part series. Today's conversation is going to focus on anti-Semitism in the workplace and what leaders need to know to mitigate it. And both from the regulatory environment, a legal environment, and other things. Part two will be Islamophobia in the workplace, and these topics are heady and significant and have a lot of nuances. So we've decided that it was best to separate them and let each topic have its own basically hour or 50 minutes, 50. So our next virtual conversation in December will focus on Islamophobia. And here at BiasSync, what we focus on is mitigating bias in workplaces. And we do that through a multi-pronged approach. We have bias training, bias assessments. We have diagnostics like cultural humility, equity, barrier diagnostics, inclusion. We also implement behavior change approaches, including microlearnings. We are known for our data and analytics to give organizations a state of the state and identify risk areas, but also more importantly, based on the data that we're able to present, think of it like heat mapping data, we're able to give organization leaders recommendations on priority areas to focus on, all, of course, with the top goals of decreasing organizations' discrimination claims risks, also lead to more inclusive and equitable environments, which, as you all know, there are myriad of benefits to that. So, Alyza, I start this conversation with a heavy sigh because I'm not even sure it's been yet 24 hours, but this is literally, for us, I guess, here in the United States, a day after we have seen the widely reported reports of the mob terrorist attack that occurred in Amsterdam against Israelis who had gone to Amsterdam for a soccer match. And the reports that have come out have revealed that it was a pre-planned attack by tens, if not possibly hundreds, of individuals who purported to be pro-Palestinian, meaning they were doing this for free Palestinian rights and free Palestine. Nevertheless, they orchestrated a horrific attack, if you haven't yet read about it or seen about it, in which basically the Israeli fans were targeted leaving the stadium and hunted down, chased down. In some instances, cars were used to chase them down, beaten. There were reports of knives, attacks. Last I heard, there are at least 5 or 6 people hospitalized in serious condition. There's also reports that as the Israelis were trying to run and escape this mob terrorist attack, they tried to jump into cabs, and the cab drivers either forced them out or actually drove them to dark alleys for them to be attacked. Some went into local businesses. Some of the business owners shut them out. Some went into to hotels. They were some of the terrorists managed to invade the hotel. Ultimately, it's a horrific, uh, um, hateful attack on Israelis, and it is further evidence of the world that we live in. And while we are going to focus our conversation today on anti-Semitism, how it plays out, what you need to know in the workplace, I do want to particularly point out that what happens out in the world flows into the workplace. So, Alyza, thank you for joining us. I know I want to hear more about what you do specifically at the Brandeis Center, but before we get into that, can you share your perspective on this horrific attack that has just occurred?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me here to be part of this and for that introduction. What has gone on over the last day in Amsterdam is horrific. It's a modern-day pogrom targeting Israelis and Jews and anyone who they felt was associated with those Israelis and Jews. And it is it's inexcusable, and it is something that what is so disturbing, and it's something I think we'll talk about as we, is that these things don't start at this level, right? Hate escalates. And the Anti-Defamation League has what they call their pyramid of hate, where they show the base of the pyramid is biased attitudes, right? People have these biased attitudes. If you fail to address the biased attitudes through education, through, actual engagement, then those biased attitudes gradually escalate. They'll find the slurs, the discriminatory jokes, right? And then it escalates to actual shunning and marginalizing, and then to actual exclusion, and then to violence. And then, of course, the tip of the pyramid is genocide. But you get to this level because we as a society have allowed the hate to escalate. We have failed to address it at the earlier stages. And I think, just as an introduction to this conversation, that's one of the reasons why the conversation we'll have today is so important, because what we're trying to do is say, look, in the workplace, let's address the bias at the lower level of the pyramid, because if we don't, it's not going to go away. And many times people think, oh, it'll blow over, right? It doesn't blow over. It gets worse. And so we need to understand the root causes. We need to understand how it manifests, and we need to understand then what steps to take to address it.
And I think it's also important to be aware that, particularly for your Jewish employees, or those who, by the way, may be married to to individuals who are Jewish, who have family members who are Jewish, that this creates fear. There is a lot of fear and anxiety amongst Jews around the world, to the extent that many are masking who they are, meaning they're removing signs that are, visibly Jewish, whether it's their kippahs or their jewelry or whatever the case is. There's a high level of anxiety, and it's not limited to where these attacks are occurring. I think what we've seen over this past year since October 7th, and some of these protests that have turned extremely hostile, violent, vandalism, targeting is upped the anxiety and the fear. So we have to recognize that that exists amongst your Jewish employees. So before we get more into that, would you please tell us more about the great work that you do there at the Brandeis Center and you yourself?
Thank you. So the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law is a nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we work with clients and universities and students, employees across the country. It was set up about 12 years ago to use legal tools specifically. We focus on the law to combat anti-Semitism. We started with our initial focus being in the university space in higher education. We've expanded now to also address the anti-Semitism in the K through 12 space, and as well in corporate, in the corporate workplace. So we provide training for both administrators at universities and employers in the workplace to understand their legal obligations, and then to understand contemporary anti-Semitism, how it manifests, what your legal obligations are, and how to address it. And then we also are contacted by students and employees and faculty and staff on campuses, for example, who are experiencing this anti-Semitism or who are feeling compelled to hide their Jewish identity. And we work with them in the corporate space. One of the things we've seen recently, particularly since October 7th, 2023, is a dramatic increase in corporate employees seeking employee resource groups for their Jewish employees. And so we've worked with employees who are trying to negotiate and get those created in order to provide them with the support that they feel they need.
Yes, and we'll talk more about how company leaders should be looking at those requests. So I think at this point, what I want to highlight is the regulatory environment that we are seeing around essentially warning organizations. Some of it's higher ed focused. We're seeing some trends in addressing workplaces around mandates to address anti-Semitism. So as an example, there are 2 states, and we believe that there are others coming, Ohio and California, that have already enacted statewide mandates to do anti-Semitism training and have a plan. It's not just training, but have a plan to address anti-Semitism in higher ed. And what's interesting to me is not normally that we put a political lens over the topics we cover, but California being presumably a Democratic state, Ohio being presumably a Republican state, the point being that this is a priority across the board. We do know that there are efforts in Congress. We expect that there will be more actions. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act has already been working its way through Congress. We do have reason to believe that there are going to be more efforts to somehow strongly influence workplaces to also conduct anti-Semitism training, and also under that falls the requirement to address race, faith, religion, bias, because, and we'll get into that more. So it's not just anti-Semitism, but those categories are also a factor of that. And it's fully expected that we're going to see more of that. So I would say the headline for leaders and organizations is to understand that there is going to be a lot more attention on this. It's fully anticipated. And then the other thing is the EEOC has recently come out with communication specifically geared to workplace leaders about reminding, I guess I would use the word in layman's terms, reminding workplaces that discrimination based on anti-Semitism falls under the discrimination prohibitions based on race, ethnicity, faith, religion, identity, those kinds of things. So all of it simply just we feel it's very important for workplace leaders to understand the regulatory environment and that it's going to become stronger. It wouldn't surprise me where a lot of states have requirements around doing sexual harassment or harassment training, that we may be moving in that direction. Is there anything, Alyza, that you would like to add to that in terms of what you see in the regulatory environment?
So I think you're absolutely right. And while the legislation that was in California and Ohio, I think was initially spurred by the dramatic rise that we see in anti-Semitic incidents in the university space, on the campuses. There are those reports that it had increased 500% over the last year. Some even have reported as high as 700% over the last year. And so there is a recognition that we need to address it, not only as a Jewish issue, right? People need to understand that combating anti-Semitism is not just for Jews alone, but that society needs to address this. In fact, the Biden national strategy to counter anti-Semitism last year referenced how important it was for this to be an all of society approach to countering anti-Semitism, I think to countering all bias, because at its root, right, what the bias is, what the anti-Semitism is a baseless, when it comes to Jews, a baseless conspiracy theory, right? It is not rooted in truth. And often what happens, particularly with anti-Semitism, is that it's an easy, convenient way to kind of scapegoat and use blame the Jew as an excuse for what is an issue that may really have a much deeper underlying cause. But if you can blame the Jew, you never have to address what the underlying real root of the discontent is, right? And so then the discontent just grows because blaming the Jew doesn't solve the problem, because that never was the source of the problem to begin with, right? This is the problem with anti-Semitism. And so there is a need. And the university, the legislation that you see is very interesting, because while it, I think, initially comes from an understanding and application over the last 20 years of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which applies to any entity that receives federal funds, that law has developed an understanding of how to protect members of faith-based communities on what's called their actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. Our shorthand will talk about their shared ancestry or ethnicity. And the reason why that had to develop kind of that body of law, if you want to say, is because Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, as opposed to Title VII, which applies in the employment context, Title VI does not include religion as a protected category. So the question was, well, clearly members of faith-based groups are still protected by Title VI. And the answer is yes, when they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry or ethnicity, as opposed to their religious practice. Now that understanding is being brought also into the Title VII employment space. So what you're seeing in here, right, because the universities are the workplace for the faculty, they're the workplace for the staff. So if you're going to be talking about the creation of a hostile environment for employees on the basis of their shared ancestry, ethnicity, that needs to also be understood as a hostile environment under Title VII guidelines.
That's applicable to workplaces.
Exactly. So, for example, the California law actually has a section that describes nationality. And you might think, right, as we're talking about Amsterdam, that, oh, that's a clear case of national origin discrimination if you're going to target an Israeli. But they make clear in the California statute that nationality, they've added also the words or national identity in quotes, and they say nationality or national identity includes a person's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, citizenship or residency in a country with a dominant religion or distinct religious identity. Discrimination against Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Christian, or Buddhist students, because this was talking about on campus, or students of another religious group, when the discrimination involves racial, ethnic, or ancestral slurs or stereotypes, constitutes discrimination on the basis of nationality or national identity. And so it's important in the workplace, right, for us to understand this too, because I do think, as you're saying, that this understanding is going to be migrating from the Title VI space of the universities and the schools to the workplace, because schools are also workplaces. And
sure, absolutely.
And it will end up being the application in the corporate space as well.
Yes. And so to give all of you who are joining us a high-level sense of what we're going to cover here is we're going to, we plan to cover, for example, what is, the definition of a Jewish person, because I think there's some misconceptions around that. Then we're going to talk about various forms of identity as it pertains to be a Jewish person, or identifiers, I should say. Then we're going to talk about the definition of anti-Semitism, because a lot of people are confused about what is anti-Semitic, what's not, and then talk about what does anti-Semitic behavior look like, whether it's outright aggression, hostile actions, to microaggressions, microinvalidations, those kinds of things. And then, of course, takeaways for you as workplace leaders. So let's start, Alyza, with covering the various ways a Jewish person is a Jewish person. And so I'll give one example. There is a stereotype, a misconception that Jews are all fair colored. If I may, Alyza, use you as an example. But with a lack of understanding that Jews come from all different races and ethnicities. There are Jews who look like me. There are Afro-Latino Jews who are dark skinned, but also Hispanic. There are Black Jews. There are Asian Jews. The whole history of Jews in Shanghai is fascinating, a topic for another time. And the key thing is to understand someone can be Jewish by ethnicity, how they identify, national origin. They can also be Jewish based on the religious element of it. And there are some Jews who are Jews ethnically and by race, but they're not necessarily religious, but they're still Jewish. There are Jews, by the way, who convert. So they make a conscious decision to be a practicing Jew from faith and race, excuse me, from faith and religion. So that's the tee up for you, Alyza, to fill in the blanks.
Yes, with that introduction, it sounds so confusing. How can all these people be Jewish? And how can you even have, as you say, Jews who claim to be atheists? Well, then how are they Jewish? And the answer is that Jews define their identity in many different ways. There are some for whom the emphasis is religious practice. And that is what defines for them their Jewish identity. But there are many Jews for whom religious practice is not what they feel is the emphasis in their Jewish identity. But they will all the Jews will believe that they are part of the Jewish people. And what does it mean to be part of the Jewish people? What it means to be part of the Jewish people is that we believe we're descended from the ancient Israelites. When you go back to the tradition and the biblical stories, the idea that the Israelites are descended from the 12 sons of Jacob, the tribes of Jacob. His name was changed to Israel, These are literally the sons, B'nai Yisrael, the sons of Israel, are the children of Israel. And the idea is that the Jewish people understand themselves as being a people who share a common history and a common heritage. And that common ancestry, is marked in some of the holidays. So you can celebrate the Passover Seder. The Passover Seder is the tradition that says, well, we are recalling our ancestors who were liberated from slavery in Egypt. You have, coming up in December, the Hanukkah story. You have Jews who will say, oh, the Maccabees who fought the Greeks and ended up rededicating the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, That Hanukkah story is the story of our ancestors. It is impossible to separate the history and ancestry of the Jewish people from the land of Israel. The land of Israel is where the identity of the Jews as a people was forged. They lived in that country with a king, King David. King David built the temple. But the identity of the community and the customs and the culture and the traditions all are deeply rooted in the land. So, for example, the primary holidays, there are three, There's the Feast of Tabernacles, and there's the Passover holiday, and then there's Pentecost. All of them are actually rooted in the agricultural cycles in Israel, Not around. And so much of Jewish tradition, the prayers, certainly, when you look at the religious faith, the idea is that, well, we were a people in this land. The temple was destroyed, and those who came and conquered, the land, sought to exile and spread the Jews around the globe. one of the reasons why, as you correctly say, the Jews come in every different skin color and every different, from all the four corners of the earth, is because historically the Jewish people were scattered around the earth. There always remained, though, a presence in the Jews' ancestral homeland, in the land of Israel. So the Jews are indigenous to Judea, which is a portion of what is today the land of Israel. The name Jew came from Judea. This was from the tribe of Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And so you have the Jews are indigenous to Judea, then they get scattered around the world. And that's why you see Jews from the Far East, from Arab countries and Arab lands, from the southern hemisphere, all around the world. And in fact, in Israel today, are where you have people, I would say also, people don't realize how few Jews there are in the world. When you ask people, how many Jews do you think there are? Jews comprise only about 0.02% of the population in the world. And half of all the world's Jewish population, a little more than half, now resides in Israel. And more than half of those who reside in Israel now are not what you would consider white. They are Mizrahi, right, or Sephardi Jews, Jews who come from Arab lands, from Spanish lands. They are not white. And so it is a misconception to think that all Jews are white.
For
and
sure.
Historically, the history of the Jews has been for many, many centuries, right? Jews were always a minority in the lands that they lived when they were scattered, and they were treated as second-class citizens. The first time that Jews were ever offered equal rights was actually in France in 1789, when the French debated whether or not the Declaration of Rights of Man should apply to Jews. And that is the very first time that Jews were emancipated. And what we find, though, is that historically the treatment of Jews goes in cycles. So they might be in lands where they integrated, became accepted, seemed to do very well and flourish, and then boom, the situation turns dramatically, right? You end up with anti-Semitism and they get expelled, right? The expulsion of the Jews in 1492 from Spain. Jews have been, expelled. And then you have, of course, in more recent times, the Holocaust, right? When we talk again about our pyramid of hate, this is what happened in Germany. You had the Jews were completely assimilated and integrated into German society, but look how it turned. And you ended up with almost entire populations in Poland, over 3 million Jews who were killed, and in the Holocaust, over 6 million Jews who died. And so now today's population of Jews in the world is about 15 million, and it's just approaching now, again, what the population was before the Holocaust. That's how long it has taken to try and punish the number of Jews. But the key thing to remember when you talk about Jewish identity is that Jews are not just a faith, not just based on religious practice. Jews also have this shared ancestry and ethnicity. It's an ethno-religion. And we'll talk about how to better understand that ethnic component, because while one of the things you have to be worried about in the workplace is to make sure that you give the religious accommodations to accommodate the Jews' religious practice, just like you would any other faith, and need to accommodate their religious practice. There's also a component of that we see in terms of bias and discrimination that targets Jews on the basis of our peoplehood, on the basis of our shared ancestry and ethnicity, and today in particular, our ancestral connection to the land of Israel.
Exactly. And we'll talk about that too, because there's also confusion about the term Zionism, and I think it's important to share. The reason I brought this particular area of focus up is because there is a perception by some that Jews are a privileged group. And sometimes the association of privilege has to do with skin color. And the reality is, we just went over that Jews come in every skin color, every ethnicity, those kinds of things. I just wanted to highlight that. And then the second piece is to understand also that there isn't one template identity in how a Jewish person identifies. They can identify being Jewish based on a number of different things. And I felt that it was important to explain that. So now, I guess the next question is, in its most basic form, when we're talking about anti-Semitic, because I've been asked this, as well as saying this or doing that, is that anti-Semitic? I don't think that's anti-Semitic. Let's define what anti-Semitism is at its core form.
So many people refer to anti-Semitism as society's oldest hatred. And so you would think, well, if it's society's oldest hatred, we should certainly have no problem defining or recognizing it. And yet the problem is, it's probably one of the least understood, right? The most misunderstood bias. And that is because anti-Semitism looks different in each generation. There's one constant about anti-Semitism, though, and that is that it always takes whatever that society, whatever that era, that generation views as its evil or its misfortune, and it pins it on the Jew. It scapegoats the Jew. So to go back to your example, when you were talking about all Jews being labeled as white, the Nazis, right? What they sought was a pure Aryan race. They did not see the Jews as white. When you look at today's white supremacists and the Charlottesville March years ago, when they are talking about the Jews will not replace us, they're saying we're white, the Jews are not white, right? In other words, they don't view the Jews as white. And yet today, often when you have those who divide the world into the binary of the oppressed and the oppressors, then anti-Semitism will say, oh, the Jews are the evil one, right? That's how anti-Semitism works. Evil, something we don't like, the Jews to blame. The Jew is the scapegoat. So what
Jews are responsible.
exactly.
Yes.
So the Jew automatically gets lumped into the oppressor class or category, which is why today you will see so many folks who will say, oh, well, all Jews, doesn't matter on their skin color, right? All Jews are suddenly white colonizing oppressors, because that's the way anti-Semitism works. And that's one of the things that we have to really work to protect against. So the anti-Semitism, if you understand that what anti-Semitism is essentially doing is labeling the Jew as the source of the misfortune, then the next step that anti-Semitism does is it seeks to push the Jew out, right? Because if the Jew is the source of the problem, society would be better off without the Jews. So to go back again to the example of the Nazis had the Jews wear a yellow Star of David to label them so that people could see them, with the idea being you don't engage with the person who's wearing that Star of David. They are to be shunned. You don't use them as your doctors or your lawyers or shop in their stores, and you push them out of acceptable society. And then obviously the next step was genocide. But if that is the way that anti-Semitism works, then if you recognize that today, one of the differences we have between the time of the Holocaust and now is that there are not only individual Jews scattered around the globe, there's actually a Jewish collective. There is a Jewish nation state of Israel. As I said, over half of the world's population live there. And oftentimes what we see today is that country, Israel, is treated not as the same way people would treat other countries in the world and maybe debate their policies or maybe be critical of certain actions that are taken, but rather they treat Israel as this Jewish collective. So the way you've seen anti-Semitism historically treat the Jew, and we'll get to this more when we talk about the definition of anti-Semitism, now is kind of layered on top of Israel as the collective Jew. So for example, if the idea was you blame the Jew for today's greatest evil, you will have those who will say, well, which country in the world is the worst offender when it comes to human rights violations? They don't point to Iran. They don't point to North Korea. They don't point to Russia or to China. Instead,
South
they say
Africa. Yeah.
the Jewish state is the worst offender when it comes to human rights violations. And then what's the next step? If the next step has been that society has tended to push individual Jews out of society, well, the next step would be to try and push Israel out as the collective Jew. And that's what you actually see. There's no other country in the world that people say has no right to exist. No one suggests that Iran or North Korea have no right to exist. And so Erwin Cutler, who is the former Canadian Special Envoy on combating anti-Semitism and a renowned international human rights attorney, once explained that Traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society, but this newer form of anti-Semitism seeks to do the same to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state of Israel. It seeks to deny it its place in the society of nations. And that's a form of contemporary anti-Semitism that many people don't understand. And when we talk about then our Jewish identity connected to Israel, which we will, that is, you begin to see how the anti-Semitism treats Israel and then treats any Jew who defines their identity as connected to Israel. What happened in Amsterdam being kind of the most extreme, one of the worst examples of it. But
Yes.
that is a way of understanding today's anti-Semitism. If it's
And so,
evil
and
on the Jew and then pushing the Jew out of society.
and then translating that into the workplace, then that becomes, you know, harassment, invalidations,
Yes,
aggression, all kinds of things. And we'll get to some specific examples of that.
yes.
Before we do that, I do want to define Zionism, because a lot of people don't understand what it means. And some people have the mistaken belief, well, I'm not against any Jewish person, I'm just against Zionists. And not recognizing that the majority of Jews identify as Zionist, which means, Alyza,
Means defining the Jews as a people with an ancestral connection to the land of Israel. That's what it is to be a Zionist. And you're right. One of the reasons why people have such a hard time addressing anti-Semitism is A, they don't understand anti-Semitism and how it works, and B, they don't understand Jewish identity and what Zionism is. So if Jewish identity is not just a religion, we're not defined just by religious practice, but we're also defined by our peoplehood. The recognition and understanding that the Jews are a people indigenous to the land of Israel, that we're a people whose history and ancestry is rooted in the land of Israel, that is what by definition is a Zionist. And if you understand that what gives the Jewish people, right, the right to self-determination in the land of Israel is this identity as a people indigenous to that land. And so while folks may disagree about what the borders should be of a Jewish state, what exactly should be the nature of a Jewish state, right? The idea of having an homeland, a safe space for Jews in the world, in their ancestral homeland in some borders, stems from this idea that the Jews are a people indigenous to the land of Israel. And what's happening today, and we're seeing this in the workplaces as well as in schools, is that there is a deliberate erasure and denial of this part of Jewish identity. There are those who will say, oh no, Jews are only a faith. You are only permitted to define your Jewish identity as being about religious practice, as being about celebrating these holidays. But the minute you define your identity as being part of a people that has a history rooted in this land, that's unacceptable to us. That makes you a Zionist. That makes you evil. That makes you somehow a complicit in genocide or ethnic cleansing or apartheid or whatever the evil term is. And for years now, we've actually seen this is Einat Wilf, who's a former Knesset member, used to call it, or still calls it, her placard strategy, where she says you would have the concept is the Star of David that represents the Jew equals Zionist, this term, equals whatever the evil concept is. It could be ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocide.
genocide.
You put it in, not to have a discussion about, well, does this conduct actually amount to apartheid? Does it amount to ethnic cleansing? Does it amount? No, nobody's getting into those discussions because, quite frankly, those allegations do not meet the definitions of those terms. But that's not why they're being put there. They're being put there most frequently by people who want to just demonize the Jew. And they want to demonize the Jew in order to push the Jew out of society, out of that acceptable society. And that's why what Einat says is, on the campuses, you used to actually see sometimes those posters that had those equations or very similar to it. And then after October 7th, 2023, you started to see the one that says, now let's keep our society clean. And it has the Star of David in the trash can.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the idea. Okay, we've labeled them as evil. They're the cause and the root of our problem. Now let's get rid of them. And that's
I know we're covering a lot. It's deep. I think for the workplace, for workplace leaders, what's important to understand that for Jews, trying to separate the idea of, oh, we're okay with Jews, we're not okay with Zionists. For Jews, it is virtually the same thing. For Jews, it lands as Jew hatred. So I want to transition to
It
now.
does,
Yeah,
because this is an integral part of my ancestry, right? In other words, what you're saying to me is that I somehow have to disavow my people's history in order to be welcomed or accepted or feel safe even in this space, right? I have to somehow deny that the Jews are a people with this ancestral heritage in order to be accepted. That's why it's landing, right, as this attack on me on the basis of my identity, because I do define my identity. This is an integral piece of my identity, is my people's history.
yes. So now I'd like to talk about how anti-Semitism can manifest in the workplace or does manifest in the workplace. And again, these are complex. So we don't expect workplace leaders to be experts on all of this overnight. But I like to say, and Lisa, either correct me if I'm wrong or add to what I'm saying, if you can empathize or hear when, let's just say, someone who's Black or who's of a different ethnicity say, I feel uncomfortable because this happened, or I feel, and substitute when a Jewish person raises a concern, and just substitute Black and harassment and microaggressions and microinvalidations, it's the same thing. Just you're just substituting the identity group for one to the other. Could you either correct me or elaborate a little bit more for leaders in the workplace to kind of understand when it's necessary for them to either address this, deal with this, or address complaints?
So one of the challenges that we see in the workplace and on the campuses is that administrators and employers have a very difficult time distinguishing between what is a legitimate discussion of political ideas, like what's a political debate, and what is really the vilification of Jews, or what's at least landing for Jews as vilifying them, disparaging them, demonizing them on the basis of an integral part of what defines their Jewishness. That's the challenge. And it's one of the things, and maybe in answer to this question, I'll also touch on the definition of anti-Semitism, because one of the things that the definition of anti-Semitism tries to do is help folks understand exactly that. How do you distinguish between a good faith political debate and criticism of Israel that's similar to that leveled against any other country, the way we would debate politics, versus the vilification, disparagement, and dehumanizing of Jews on the basis of our Jewish identity, which would be anti-Semitic, right? Criticizing Israel, its policies, is not anti-Semitic, but vilifying Jews is anti-Semitic. So the definition of anti-Semitism, which is viewed as kind of the gold standard definition, is one that's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, or IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It was issued in 2016. The IRA is unlike so many of the other definitions that are out there, which are, each year you'll have scholars who try to come up with definitions. The IRA definition was passed by an intergovernmental body. At the time, it had over 31 countries. Now there are over 40 countries that adopted this definition unanimously. This meant all the governments of these countries were recognizing this definition and agreed that they needed to have a common understanding of what anti-Semitism was in order to effectively combat it. Now, that was in 2016. 6 years earlier, the United States actually used a precursor to this definition and adopted their own, right? The US State Department adopted its own definition of anti-Semitism, which you can still get when you Google State Department definition of anti-Semitism. The State Department is now using the IRA definition, but they had their own. And one of the things that I liked about this earlier version of the IRA definition is, for all intents and purposes, they're identical. The main difference is how they present it on the page. So the way the definition is set out, the IRA definition and this 2010 definition, is it starts with a definition itself of anti-Semitism at the top, and then it has a list of examples so that in context, using the examples, you can understand how the definition works. Now, one of the things that's important to note is that both the 2010 and the IHRA definition, state explicitly that this is not about silencing criticism of Israel, because it actually states that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be considered anti-Semitic. That's not what we're talking about. So what are we talking about? Well, what the definition in 2010 did is it had the box and then it had the examples, but it pulled out of the list those examples relative to Israel and put it on the second page under a heading that says, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? Which is one of the things that in the workplace and in schools, right, we're struggling with today. And it had this heading, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? And in 3 categories: demonize Israel, double standard for Israel, and delegitimize Israel. And it breaks down the examples and lists them under these 3 categories. These 3 categories are categories that were actually developed by Natan Sharansky, who was a Soviet refusenik. He was in solitary confinement in the Gulag in the former Soviet Union because he was refused the permission to leave Israel to emigrate, leave Russia to emigrate to Israel, purely because he was a Jew. And ultimately, when he was finally released, he went to Israel. He ultimately became a member of the parliament there, of the Knesset, head of the Jewish agency. And he tried to help develop, how do you recognize this distinction? And he said the distinction is when the criticism of Israel falls into these 3 categories, then it crosses the line into anti-Semitism. So demonize Israel, that's when you think about the traditional anti-Semitic caricature of the Jew as greedy, conniving, bloodthirsty. You can envision that caricature of the Jew with the hook nose and just the evil look. But instead of it being now applied to individual Jews, as we talked about before, it's applied to Israel as the Jewish collective. Israel's greedy, Israel's conniving, Israel's bloodthirsty. That's not a discussion about specific policies of the government of Israel. That is demonizing Jews, the collective Jew, the same way you would demonize the individual Jews. Double standard is what we see at the UN. You have more resolutions condemning Israel than you have against all the other countries combined. So you think about some of those other countries, like I said, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, none. You add all of these together, you still don't come close to how many times they demonize. They have a standing at the Human Rights Council, a standing agenda item, basically to target Israel. That's applying a double standard. And then there's delegitimize. So delegitimize Israel is defined as denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by suggesting that Israel has no right to exist. Well, that's the way IHRA defines it, or the early one, suggesting that Israel is a racist endeavor. Sorry, I have that opposite. The 2010 one was it has no right to exist, or that Israel is a racist endeavor. But if you think about the beginning of that, right, that denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. If I want to criticize policies of Israel, that's fine. But if I say that Israel has no right to exist, what I'm really saying is, oh, you Jews, you're not a people. You're only a faith. You're only a religion. You don't have any history in this land. You don't have any ancestry. You're not indigenous to this land. So it is, again, it's erasing and denying my identity as a Jew. It's not a political statement. It's denying who I am on the basis of my Jewish identity. And so it's understanding this. And what we see in the workplace, right, is everything from, you may have employees who are saying and expressing things that cross the line into anti-Semitism, where they may think they're making a comment about the politics, but either they're suggesting Zionists aren't welcome in our midst, right? Or Israel has no right to exist, which is erasing, as we just said, Jewish identity. And they're not understanding how it lands for their colleague. And so for their colleague, this is now landing as something that is demanding that I somehow shed or deny or hide my ancestry, my history, my identity in order to fully engage in the workplace. Sometimes we see that there are employers who will issue statements that they mistakenly think are meant to be inclusive because they'll comment on the political situation. And they also don't realize how their company statement is landing and is actually making part of their employee community feel very isolated and targeted because the comments are erasing and denying the Jews' history. So for example, referring to Israelis as colonizers, if you understand that the Jews are an ethnic group that come from Israel and that you can't colonize a place you're from, then you would understand you shouldn't be referring to Israelis as colonizers.
Sure, sure. You know, I think it's also important to acknowledge that in the time that we're living in right now, which is now just over a year since October 7th happened in Israel, that what's happened there in the Middle East is very triggering for a lot of people, not just Jews, of course. And unfortunately, the imagery and documentation of innocent civilians being caught up in the attack, but then also in Israel's defensive actions related to that. Again, separating Israel, the country, in its policies versus the empathy that normal people have. And by the way, and I want to say, Jews also don't want to see innocent people caught up in warfare. But that has led to, in the workplace, including amongst leaders, strong, visceral opinions about what is happening between Israel and Gaza, now Israel and Lebanon, and other things. And there may be leaders who don't recognize that their personal feelings, and because we're human, who wouldn't be impacted by that, are flowing into potentially how they're perceiving what is or what's not going on in the workplace, and complaints or concerns by either Jewish individuals or individuals who support the Palestinians and those kinds of things. And I just want to acknowledge that that is also an issue right now because it is so visceral. So I kind of like to say it's important to take off the personal feelings hat and look at this, put on your company or organization leader hat, and just understand for your Jewish employees the types of ways that they're feeling either victims of marginalization or harassment or invalidation. So I'll name some that are that we know have occurred in workplaces. We've seen and heard reports of, people not wanting to work with other people, other groups of people. I don't want to work with Jews. I don't want to work with even Muslims in some cases, or whatever the case is. But this idea that or feeling or belief that I don't want to work with that person. You need to understand that. That's an issue around inclusiveness, and those kinds of things that need to be addressed. You may see people wearing pins of some sort or another that may land. We've seen some reports that have been public where employees of companies have worn, for example, pins where they have a strikeout over the state of Israel that conveys Israel shouldn't exist, or comments like, "Oh, you're Jewish. Oh, so are you for killing kids?" That kind of stuff. Then there are colleagues who are seeing what their colleagues are posting on their social media. So they may be friends on social media, and then they're seeing comments and things that are being posted that they may be, participating in some of these micro-invalidations or outright anti-Semitism and those kinds of things. So that's why I keep going back to, you don't have to be the expert on anti-Semitism. Obviously, knowledge about it helps. But just replace when a Jewish colleague comes to you with a concern or a risk or etc., is replace that with, if this was an individual who is Black who comes to me about their concern, or a different ethnicity or a different identity, how would I treat this concern or complaint? So, and by the way, I do want to say that if you have, boy, we've talked a lot. If you have any questions, please share them now. We will try to get to them. But Alyza, so what would be the advice that you would give to organization leaders about how to address concerns? And then I do want to talk about the ERG groups that you mentioned.
So I think what's really important is to try to educate your employees to understand Jewish identity. and then to be sensitive, right, as we speak about all kinds of bias, sensitivity, or I like your cultural humility. I like that term very much.
Mhm.
I think that that's one of the things that's key. And nobody is saying that you cannot have your own opinions. I think you're right, though, when you come into the workplace, in order to make sure that we're able to have a welcoming, inclusive workspace where everyone can cooperate, collaborate, work together, sometimes it's necessary to, when you realize that your opinions could be forcing or compelling individuals to feel that they are not welcome, or that they're somehow less than because of their identity in that space. It's better in that space to keep those feelings to yourself, right? Because otherwise you are going to be creating a space where someone is going to feel unwelcome at the table, right? And
And I think to kind of encapsulate it, it's like we all know as organization leaders, we know that we need to do everything possible to not create a hostile work environment. If you look at it from that perspective and understand what can happen that creates a hostile work environment for your Jewish employees, that would be my one of my recommendations. And Alyza, I know that you mentioned this. We mentioned that if you have Jewish personnel who are coming to you and asking you for example, as an ERG group, your response is, so you don't violate discrimination issues, is
yes, provide them. If you have employee resource groups for other ethnic identities, then I actually believe you're obligated to provide the ERG group for the Jewish community, because they are also a group that is, as we say, it's not just a religious group. They have a group with a shared ancestry and ethnicity. And in particular, today, the kind of harassment and discrimination that Jews are experiencing is targeting them not on the basis of their religious practice. It's targeting them on the basis of this shared ancestral and ethnic heritage. And it's for that reason that they're asking for the ERGs. And so you must not deny the Jewish group the ethnic support group that you're providing to other ethnic communities in your workplace. And we have
and
materials on that.
the key piece being ethnic as opposed to religion. Right.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
by the way, a lot of organizations think, oh, we shouldn't talk about religion in the workplace. Guess what? You can't really avoid it
Right.
right now, meaning that it's being talked about. You can't really
Right.
pretend.
And it's not suggesting, right, that you're uh, creating a group, again, to deal with the religious practice piece of this identity. You're creating the ERG group to address the national ancestry, right? The ancestral and ethnic heritage of this community. And if you are doing that for other, ethnic groups, then I think you have to have an obligation to do it for your Jewish community, your Jewish employees as well.
There's a lot more we can talk about. I will say that here at BiasSync, we do have a combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia module that incorporates asynchronistic training, also a cultural humility assessment, because we talk about it by using cultural humility strategies to minimize the risk of hostile workplace complaints, outright discrimination. You can certainly contact us about that. We also offer, in addition to that, live trainings. We've gone out of our way to really identify really good experts. It's actually quite difficult to find qualified experts. When I say qualified, what I'm referring to is to really understand these issues and how they manifest in the workplace. So we have several that we've identified, including Alyza and others. We like to say that the holistic approach is to do the online asynchronistic training and then incorporate some virtual live component to that as well. So if you have interest, if you think this would be a value, would like more information, by all means, contact us. I'm sorry that we didn't get to get that. Oh, Danielle, you want a transcript? We're actually going to be following up and giving everyone a link to see this on demand. We'll answer your question about the transcript for you. There might be some button or something that we can do to do that. We are going to give everyone a recap of this conversation and also tips and some resources for you to understand, to help you, all with the ultimate goal of making sure that we're doing everything we can to create an inclusive and equitable environment for all your employees, and giving you as organization leaders tools to help you in that endeavor. Alyza, thank you so much for this very insightful conversation. I know we'll come back for another.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Michele. It's been good to be here and to have this conversation. And as you say, we're happy to follow up if there are those who want additional training for their organizations, for their companies. We are happy to work with you at BiasSync and with them.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you all.